Okay, so intentional design to include and engage students, known as Universal Design for Learning, or UDL for short, was conceived as a way to engage and include students with disabilities originally. But of course, we found that these principles can be useful and engaging and inclusive of all students, of everyone who comes into our classrooms. And chances are good that you're already practicing UDL principles in some way or another, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you about your experiences in the classroom. And just to give you a sense then of how the workshop is going to proceed, we're going to begin with the panel. We have a panel of faculty and students here who will share briefly their experiences with Universal Design for Learning. Ada Jarsma, Leah Serpentini, Cordelia Snowden, and Janet Arnold are all here. They will each speak for 5 minutes. And then we'll have an opportunity to open up the floor for question period. Pat Pardo also joins us, and she'd be happy to share her expertise and passion for UDL during that time. And then at about 10:45, I'm going to shut that all down, no matter how amazing the conversation is going, so that we can actually put some of these principles to work and think about what we might do in our own classrooms to implement some of the things that we hear today, and to be able to talk amongst ourselves and to have our very knowledgeable panelists circulating amongst us to talk with us about through some ideas. So that'll be at about 10:45. We'll get started on that. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for being here. So I'm Ada. I'd like to begin by acknowledging Pat Pardo. I'm so happy you're here, Pat. When I started thinking about disability studies and thinking differently about the classroom, I met with Pat quite a few times, and it sparked so many ideas. So I'm really grateful and excited to continue the conversation. So one of the truisms, I guess we could say, about inclusive design is that there's no perfect template and it's never done. And that sounds kind of negative, but I see that actually as a deeply positive thing. So it's generative and collaborative, the approach to teaching and learning that we'll be talking about. So it's so great that you're here, and I can't wait to hear what questions and insights that you will have. I'd like to begin, so there's a handout in front of you. I'd like to begin with 3 quotations that I find really helpful as a way to start sharing some vocabulary together so that we can be referring to some of these ideas together as we go. And it's also a way to orient ourselves towards this paradigm or this framework that we're talking about today, inclusive design. So the first one is from a fantastic resource that I recommend to everybody here called Accessible Syllabus. And it's kind of quite a straightforward sentence. All classroom choices affect, possibly exclude students. To teach is to make classroom choices. And this discussion today is an invitation for us to relate to our own choices and start to think about, especially that first word, all. Second sentence is from another great resource from Vanderbilt University, designing that address the needs of diverse students from the start, so that all students may benefit. This to me is one of the challenges of inclusive design. It's not retroactive. We can learn about things retroactively, but really this is a call to be proactive. And so to start thinking about design and choices from the beginning, so that ideally the spaces are as inclusive to all students as possible. And then the third sentence, I think, is a political, ethical, and moral one. Meaningful access requires collective labor. So there's no way to be perfect at this, and there's certainly no way to do it alone. And so the kinds of conversations that I hope we'll have today are precisely what we need in order to be able to pull this off, really. So what I have found really useful in learning about inclusive design is this phrase that's the subtitle on my handout, beyond accommodation. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the practices that Pat's office sets up. Students get accommodation forms, they give them to us. What I think this paradigm asks us to do is perhaps to see those forms as an invitation to recognize barriers in our classroom. So the more inclusive our designs are, the less those forms need to translate into action because the action has already been taken. So I'm wondering if we might, each of us, even now privately, think of a form we've received, recently and see if that helps us pinpoint a barrier that's right now, either in our syllabus, in the way we run our space, the way we're assessing students, and could we together imagine a concrete, pragmatic way to do away with that barrier so that all students will benefit from this accommodation as opposed to one student. There's a bit more on the handout from the wonderful Accessible Syllabus website, including language that we might be incorporating into our syllabi. The first suggestion there, examine traditional policies. This will be so different for all of us. We all inherit different assumptions about teaching. We all get things going in different ways. I'll just share one that I have been thinking about. So the traditional policy I've been using for years and years is to have participation marks. And I've been challenged by disabled students in particular to change that to engagement points and to be much more explicit and upfront on the syllabus what that translates into. It ends up being a much greater array of activities than my participation mark used to refer to. And so that's been my own shift that I've been trying to work with. You can look at the other suggestions maybe on your own. I've included the principles of universal design on the syllabus, and I've bolded my favorite, which is flexibility. And this is something that I've especially learned from Dr. Pat Pardo, that we often assume, I'm in philosophy, we assume that there's one particular way in which a student needs to learn an outcome, but the truth is there could be 50 ways. And it doesn't mean that the outcome goes away, but it's a really exciting invitation to be much more expansive in the trajectories towards that outcome. And I'm going to hand it over to Leah in just a second. So if you don't mind flipping the handout to the last section there, I have a quotation from a new book on inclusive design called Mismatch from MIT Press. And there are 3 principles that she writes that I think really they remind me of the things that Leah has taught me. So this is a way to set up, passing it over to Leah. The first one, recognize exclusion. Such a hard thing to do because of how that statement has been explained. Exclusion happens when we solve problems using our own biases. We teach the way we like to learn. And the challenge is, can we notice how our own learning is not the same kind of learning that every student might want to, might benefit from? So that's a deeply challenging proposition to all of us. Second one, learn from human diversity. Human beings are the real experts in adapting to diversity, and the expert here is the student. So can we together think about how we might learn and gain feedback loops from our students who are the experts in adapting to barriers and exclusions? The last one, solve for one, extend to many. So when we find a way to respond to an accommodation request, for instance, in a way that expands that accommodation to everyone, then it's a fair promise that everyone in our class, including us, our teachers, will be able to benefit in really palpable, exciting ways. And I'll move it over to Leah. Thank you.
So I'm Leah. I'm a student here at Mount Royal, 5th year psych major, sociology minor. And through these 5 years, I've gotten used to adjusting myself to different systems and to different professors. But one overarching issue has continued to persist. And I just want to talk a little bit about that experience as a student and why design matters so much in classrooms. So the obvious is academic outcome. Grades are important. If you remember back to your undergrad or grad school, those are pretty important, and they can totally hinge on the way an assignment is set up or the atmosphere in a classroom is set up. Mental and physical health, whether it's a pre-existing condition or something that comes from the stress of school and having to adjust to those settings, those are serious issues that need to be considered. And just the premise of accessible spaces in general. And what I'd love to see is just making inclusive the standard and the default, and not something that we're slowly learning to, we might have to adjust for one person or the other, but that's the preset. And from my experience, I've just, it depends on the professor, it depends on the class, but overall, there's still so many kinds of systems and designs in place that are outdated or inflexible that can be inaccessible or even debilitating to students. And I think that needs the most attention right now is how are we still debilitating these students? And one quote that I often draw off of is a disability scholar, Margaret Price, who basically says that people are maybe actually inhabiting, or people are inhabiting different spaces, even if they are in the same literal classroom, because of what's happening in their inner worlds. So to carry that with you in every space that you're in as a professor, as on the institutional level, on different committees, just to know that we're all in this class, or in this room right now, but we're experiencing it in different ways, and to be able to like just bring that consideration with those diverse needs that might need to be met with that in mind. And a little goes a long way is all I can say in terms of professors and on the institutional level. What could just be as simple as transparency as a professor has huge implications for a student. And that's all. I'll leave it at there. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Since UDL is really about supporting students, I took the opportunity to ask some of my peers examples of things that their profs had done to add to my own, and then ask what did that mean to them, or why was it beneficial. And one of them, I really loved their quote. They said, "It was like the prof was finally speaking my language when they incorporated universal design and they tried these different principles." And I don't know, it gives me goosebumps, because it's like, how long were they going where the prof wasn't speaking their language, and how much were those barriers really impacting their learning, that now it's made such a difference in that student's life. So some of the examples I've heard were slides being sent ahead of time. This meant that the student didn't have to out their accommodation need, they just had it met and they didn't have to go through that process. They also had the choice of working individually or in groups. So if they felt comfortable working with groups, or if they were more independent and they didn't have social skills or things like that, they were able to work independently. Another one is they could submit their essays, or they could submit a PowerPoint with videos and images to show their learning. So if they weren't necessarily the best academic writer and they couldn't convey what they understood in a paper, they could submit it in a different format to still show that they understood it and met the outcomes. They just didn't have to write it. Another example was, and this was in one of my classes, is you could submit a poster that you had hand-drawn, which was kind of the intent, was to hand-draw a systems map. But then they also gave the flexibility of, if you're not artistic, or if you just want to do it in a different format, use pictures or create it online, they were able to do that. So it wasn't about being marked on whether or not you could draw something convincing. It was, could you map the system and use whatever tools you needed to make that happen. These are just some examples of ways that our profs have made classes more inclusive and incorporated UDL. And I think it's really valuable to look at those, and then also always pair them with, what are the barriers that are stopping people from adopting these? There are many, and I have a couple here, and I'm hoping that we can take this opportunity to talk about the barriers a little bit, because some of them might seem like barriers, but after dissecting them a little bit, it's actually easy to address. So the major one is time. Incorporating UDL takes a lot of time, and I respect that and acknowledge it. This is not something that happens overnight and suddenly your course is completely universally accessible. But taking as much time as you can and incorporating in steps is completely okay. And try something out and recognize where there's barriers that you can't address. But yes, we acknowledge that it does take time and effort. Also, there's concerns about maintaining professional standards and making sure that we're preparing students for the workforce. Completely understandable. Maybe there's ways around that. Also, there's courses that faculty don't necessarily have control over. So how can you make something accessible when you're not in control of it? As well as deadlines, making sure that we're teaching students that this is how it's going to be in the workforce. If there's a deadline and you miss it, like, potentially you could be fired. So we want to set them up for reality, but also, are there other ways we can do that? So thank you for listening and coming today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Good morning. I'm Janet Arnold, and I am an access advisor with Accessibility Services, and I teach in psychology. So my role here today kind of combines both, which I'm quite thrilled about. In terms of my teaching, the handout that you have shows how I do assessments in the class. And I've created a variety of different ways that students can be assessed. So one of them is the chapter quizzes, which is straight out of the textbook. It's Blackboard. They have as much time as they want to complete the quiz. Now, when I started, I used to have it, the expectation was you finish the quiz prior to the class, by midnight before the class. And then my wise colleague said, well, that's not very universally designed. So now the deadline is the last day of classes, which certainly for some students, it's up to them whether they read the chapter before the class, which I really hope that they do, but also recognizing that sometimes life gets in the way. So I don't want to penalize them for that. So they do have until the end of the semester to complete all those chapter quizzes. So that is one element of universal design that, again, I have to respect that the student is here to learn the best that they can. So I give them the opportunity to do that. The in-class reflections, that's a way for me to assess how are the students connecting with the material that was talked about in that class. So for example, our last class was on children and death and dying, and the reflection was, what skills do you have as a person to be able to support a child who is dying or who's grieving? So they're connecting the material to their own personal skills. I used to only have them fill out a little card at the end of the class, so they get 10 minutes to do that. Not so universally designed, so they have a choice. They can do the card at the end of class, or they can upload their answer to Blackboard by midnight the next day. So this is an example of creating universal design in just very small ways that can make a huge difference to students. We have exams. Now, I was great at writing exams, but not all students are. So 40% of the class is on their midterms and their finals. So that's textbook, typical short answer, multiple choice exams. So there's a bit of variety in them. And they also have some choice within the exam. So for one topic, I might provide 2 questions that address the same thing, but they choose one of those questions to answer. On the death portfolio, so this is really having students face their own deaths, there's a variety of about 13 different exercises within that, and there's some choice within those exercises. So they can fill out like a document that I've created, a survey type thing, or they can write a paragraph or a one-pager about that. So it's hard to bring this into reality. So one of them is, what do you want to happen at, what do you want your death to be like? So there's a questionnaire to fill that out. So if they'd rather not fill that out, they can just write a paragraph. Here's what's going to happen when I die. I'm going to be in bed, all these people around me. So again, students have a choice, and that's building in universal design. I think sometimes when people consider universal design, they think, oh my gosh, I have to have it perfect. I have to do everything right. And as a panel, our invitation to you is pick one thing. I've been slowly integrating universal design into my class over the past few years. So it's step by step, and each step is a real success. So most of you are already doing universal design on some level. You just might not know that yet. So by coming here today, hopefully some light bulbs are going on in your mind saying, oh yeah, I already do that. Good for me. And that's what we want. We want to celebrate this with you. So I guess that's all I will say about my assessment process.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, everyone. So we've heard about how universal design is all about flexibility and choice and autonomy for students in 3 different areas. So universal design is about offering multiple means of representation. So this would be, an example would be that Janet and Ada provided you with handouts today in different sized fonts, and you could add that to slides, for instance, so that there are various ways of showing students what it is that you're trying to share with them. The second principle being multiple modes of engagement. So an example of that is the movement from participation to engagement that Ada was speaking about. about being able to ask questions by speaking them aloud in a classroom or writing them down, giving students, lots of opportunities for sharing with one another. And then finally, multiple means of expression. So thinking about, how do students have an opportunity to demonstrate what it is that they've learned. And of course, we heard quite a bit from Cordelia and Janet about different modes of assessment that you could implement in your classrooms. But I'm sure you have tons of questions. So this is our time to just engage informally with the panelists and with one another. So please feel free to jump right in. And don't forget to turn on the mic if you're going to do it vocally.
Hi. So my question is the practicality to a certain extent of universal design. I love it, but I've seen my class sizes go from 40 to 60. And so having a whole bunch of assignments come in on the last day, I think would just be really challenging when I've got multiple sections and I have over 200 students. So how do you do that?
Can I say something too provocative? And you can all say, no, that's terrible. So and it's actually more of a question. I'm starting to wonder if universal design, which is really about expanding the opportunities for students to succeed and engage in a variety of ways, if universal design is also about the instructors gaining more flexibility and capaciousness and space for us to flourish, to such an extent that I recognize assessment is crucial because we have to give grades, but could we be grading so much less through the design choices that we're making? This is really my intuition is that the answer is a strong yes. So I wonder, could we turn your question into what's already a wonderfully concrete question? Could we make it even more concrete and talk about precisely what the students are handing in, what the labor is on your part, and are there ways to, for instance, create options for the students such that the grading will change because some students will be handing in this kind of response and some students will be handing in this kind of response? Does that make sense as a question? Are you willing to share a bit about what you're grading or how you're grading?
Largely, I guess there's a leadership and communication class, so it's lots of personal reflections that are coming in. And so I find it challenging because I think authentic assessment should also be students getting that tangible, concrete information back about how they can make those improvements. And with that many students, I find that I'm not able to do that as well as what I have been in the past. So I think that's kind of a bit of something that I'm starting to lose because I just can't manage the numbers.
Can I make a suggestion?
Mm-hmm.
That's super fair because I think the accessibility and inclusion and flexibility and all that has to work with everybody. It can't just only be for the students, but it's, in terms of collective labor, it's going to be all of us. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be all by the end of the semester. I actually don't really like handing things in at the end of the semester. I'm drained by then, and every class has something or finals at the end. So I've seen other ways around it with other professors. It depends on the project and what they're asking, but I've seen them let you choose your own deadlines for if it's a final project. It doesn't have to be the last day. If you would rather time it nicely in between two projects, you could they could just sign up for March 20th instead of, the last day, or distributing it in between the first midterm and the second midterm or something. So I think as long as there's communication and transparency and a conversation about what they would prefer and what will work for everyone, then that's doing more than enough. It doesn't always have to be okay, everyone hand it all in at the last day. That's totally a reasonable concern. Mm-hmm. Just a suggestion.
Also, I'll add on that, I once asked a prof if I could hand something in early, and the reaction was, why would you want to do that? So even offering that flexibility up front and saying, it's due here, but if you want to submit it earlier, then I can give you more fulsome feedback. You don't get multiple attempts at it, but letting them know it's okay, because it's kind of is it a punishment if you're submitting early? Because sometimes it's you have 3 papers due on the same day, and it would be good if one prof was this is fine if you submit a week early. Like, I would appreciate that. So even offering that up front.
I was going to ask a question about that because I often do say, like, I have a class right now, it's a capstone course, and I said, it's due on the 13th, we need to meet, but you can hand it in anytime, right? And I'll look at it, I'll give you feedback, and then you can improve it, and sort of all of that. I think one student has so my question was more about what message, more than just the offer, would be helpful to you as a student, because I feel like I'm putting it out there, I'm giving all the reasons of why, but students aren't taking up on it. And so I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to give that option. But do you have a good line or a good, what would you want to hear as a student? Or is it just enough to put it out there? And if students take it, they take it. If they don't, they don't.
That's a really good question. I don't know necessarily the perfect answer, but I'd say reminders are really important. That might be something you already do. I have a lot of profs who go through the course outline on the first day, and then we don't hear about assignments till the due date. So even just saying, hey, this paper is due in 2 weeks. If you still want to hand it in early, having those kind of opportunities can be really helpful, because they might hear that at the first day and then completely forget later on.
I have 2 more suggestions. One is I've noticed a lot of professors make kind of fake deadlines. So it's just to get you to try to just aim for that date. And if it's a day later or a day before, that's okay. There's flexibility there, but it's not all in the same time. And also, if you want to do it at different times and disperse it for grading purposes or for the students' purposes, get them to actually sign up for that date. It's not just oh yeah, if you want to hand it in early, because every student's oh yeah, that would be great, but I when it comes down to it, you always just leave it to the last minute. So if you actually plan for it to be that's the due date, and instead of you could hand it in before that. Do you know what I mean? Something you try.
Hi there, I'm Scott from the Department of Education. Question for our student panelists. What are the kinds of assignments and tasks, assessment tasks that you've done in your experience that really engage you, that are sink your chops into, that are I really want to do this, as distinct perhaps from those that are the recall, retell, I'm jumping through a hoop kind of tasks? What are those really engaging ones?
I there was one class in particular that it was more so pick kind of a theme that's going on in the semester, and then your engagement gets pulled into that. So you're doing a little bit throughout the semester, and make sure that you, per class, are writing something about what's going on, and that's kind of your participation, which is kind of now framed into engagement. And then you hand it in as a final project at the end of the semester. So it ends up being almost more work than just a participation mark, but I could get involved in it. I could turn it my own way. I think if you can just give students this flexibility to turn it into something they really care about. And so it's still relevant to the course matter, but they had a choice to turn it into something, and then slowly they keep building up into a bigger project and a tangible thing to show for the work that they did. Those are the most accessible and engaging for me.
Sorry, before you answer, forgive me, but if I could just extend from that. So the tangible project, writing, art making, are there particular...
And just open.
Really? Okay.
So open, yeah. If you want to hand it in as an essay, you can hand it in as an essay. If you want to hand it in as a binder of different, a physical, tangible copy of a journal of what's going on every class. If you want to do a PowerPoint slide, that openness was really helpful for me too.
Yeah, I had an assignment for a social innovation class with Catherine Pearl, where we had boxes that we made dioramas, and there was a written component, but also we were supposed to show the current version of the agency we were working on, but also what the vision was. And some people are crafty, they could make little clay figures, but it was also completely open in that if you just printed off pieces of paper and stuck them to the walls, that was good. And it was really hands-on, and it helped us visualize okay, this is what we wrote and this is what we think would happen, but how do you actually show that? How do you take this organization will be flourishing, or it'll be really successful and it'll be busy, but how do you show that in a diorama? Is it just the number of people, or is it like that it's brightly lit? So it really forced us to think outside the box. Because you had to show what you're writing in your paper in a physical form. So it really had us understanding the concepts that much more. And I know it's not possible to do dioramas for every single class. We also probably don't want that. But to give that kind of flexibility of like a poster or video, like it's not always got to be a paper, because sometimes you can do so much more with when you're being hands-on with it.
Hi. Thank you so much for the open conversation. Loving it. I just want to share, so I work in the business school, and for my first year students, this was a couple of years ago, but I started to think about what were ways, and I wasn't actually being intentional about universal design. I was trying to apply more workplace principles and think about how we engage employees, and how quite often providing them the autonomy and the ownership in something can be really helpful. And so accidentally, maybe I was applying universal design, and now I will do it with more intent. Here was my experience, though, is that I asked for students, so I had a very standard business problem that I asked for the students to assess and respond to. And then I had also said, if up to the first month into the course, if you wish to propose any other way to do any of these assessments, I'm all in. I'm just out of super creative ideas. So you let me know, and if it's a go and it's okay with you, I'll also share it with the class. And so I did this for a couple of years, and particularly with this small paper, what I started to do was make the standard paper they had to do worse and worse to encourage them to propose an alternative. And it was my experience, and I debriefed it with the students, that they had said, we're just so used to being told what to do and not having a lot of options. I can't get there. I don't know what you're asking of me, and it's probably just easier to write the horrible paper, even though you keep making it more horrible. So can you help me with some tools for how to better employ this? Because I'll share that I humbly did not have great success, but I think there's a space in there, and I think it was maybe in the way that I was deploying it. So I seek your advice.
I sure applaud you for that effort. And I think students have been so well trained throughout their school to do a paper and to know how to write a paper and to get fairly good grades at that. They're not so good, and we don't support them taking chances to fail. And you took a chance, and it didn't turn out quite the way that you had wanted to, but good on you. And I think if we can help students see, yes, we're all taking a risk here at trying something new, let's go down that rabbit hole and see what happens. So it's not necessarily tied to a failure, it's tied to you succeeded because you tried something different. So the grading might need to, I don't quite know what that would look like, but grading might need to shift, but to be able to say, like, let's all take a risk at this. And I would say name it and claim it. So, hey students, we're naming that this is a challenge for all of us because you know how to write good papers. So let's go outside the box a little bit. Let's take a risk, like you did with the dioramas, see what happens. And then you kind of explore that.
I wonder if there's a way to flag, for instance, one part of the current design and open it up for collective brainstorming. So for instance, a conventional design choice is to have students write something just for the professor. The professor reads it, gives it a grade. It never gets read again. I don't know, I just started to get too much malaise about that myself. I'm a little bit depressed about that. So that motivated me to start thinking differently. So for instance, if that design choice is going to change, then what if the assignments are going to be made public, open access, quite quickly the content starts to shift for students. And in my experience, it gets more exciting. It could become then a project that their families might engage with, or their friends, or at least in principle, they could share it. And then it's an interesting design provocation for you. Is there a site where you could share your students' work? If not on the internet, then we have research days on campus where students share their research. And I think it's a really exciting and wonderful thing to do. It makes the classroom more porous. I think one of the challenges to conventional teaching is that we're in our bounded classrooms, and I think what is exciting about a university is that we are actually all engaged in similar exercises. It's just we don't get to talk to each other or share. So that could be, for instance, one small design change. Students, would some of you be willing to prepare something for this assignment that's going to be shared with the community? And then I wonder, it strikes me that that could be enough to start soliciting exciting ideas.
I think you need to get the ball rolling. Sorry, I'm just gonna add one more thing. And kind of give them something to go off to inspire them to come up with those ideas. But sometimes, like from a student's experience, I just as you might run out of creative energy, so do we. And even though I'm given an option to do both, even though I just was like, that creative project was the best project I've ever had, sometimes I have to pick the easier version. If it's like, no, I'd rather just do the written response, get that over with. I'd rather do multiple choice instead of an essay. Like, I don't have the creative energy right now, but having the option was what's the most important. Like, the fact that you're giving them that option. There's someone that's probably just dying to like get out of the box they're being forced in, and then they might take that on. But some of them just really, they have to juggle all these other classes, and they just can't think, like, I can't just come up with the project, design the project, and then do the project too. Like, what are you asking of me? So I think, yeah, the choice is what matters.
I was just going to ask, we talked a lot about assessment, and at the beginning, the suggestion of like putting slides up ahead of time and things like that. But do you have other suggestions about in-class learning that you would suggest to make it more universal? So during lectures, whatever is happening in that class, but not just the assessment, but the teaching.
So quite often, if I have a topic where sort of a lecture about, then I find a video that also supports that. Or sometimes there's a diagram that will show that theory. So they get the spoken part, they get the visual, and they get a video. Sometimes they also have group discussions. So I give them a case and talk about how you would support this kid who's dying or whatever. So lots of different ways to get that information across. Those are examples that I use.
I think also breaking out into like smaller discussions, even when it's just the person beside you, because sometimes it can be intimidating if it's always a back and forth between whole class and instructor. So even to say like, okay, I want you to break up and, you know, have a little bit of a discussion in your pairs, and you don't have to report back necessarily what you're going to say. Because I find when that happens, when they're like disperse and then report back, we spend more time like trying to figure out who's going to be the poor soul to report back than actually discussing the content. So just really being flexible and saying, okay, we'll do some group discussions. Maybe we'll change the setting of the class and we'll sit in a circle. Like just trying out different things and asking for people's feedback after is a huge piece, because you can incorporate all these tools, but if you're not asking if it's successful from the students, then I mean, you could be doing something great and just not know it yet.
Shows it's on. What I found interesting was fooling around with mind mapping, and how I would come into class and I'd say, we're going to discuss what we just saw in the film or the lecture. Can we please mind map? So that indicated to me there's quite a component of engagement in the mind mapping. And some of their mind maps are actually amazing. I've been saving them. It's almost like I want to hang them up. So I found that really is good for the brainstorming. But also what I've learned to do sometimes is if I ask them to do something where it's involving a presentation of some sort, and I say to them, I'm going to grade it, not mark it. If you do it, you earn your mark paycheck. Rather than I'm going to sit there and I'm going to be grading it, because it takes the stress element out. And there's been a number of occasions where students have come to speak to me saying they stutter or they have this impediment that they cannot get up in front. And they watch the others and they notice they're not being judged. The next thing I know, they're leading the pack. and they're not stuttering and they're not nervous. So it really is highly indicative of that fear of judgment. And if the fear of judgment is pulled away in that you are just going to share, it seems to really make a difference.
Thank you. Of course, stuttering is also part of human speech. So it's not, we wouldn't want to say that stuttering is always a sign. Yeah, I think an inclusive classroom is a classroom where people are moving and speaking and engaging in a variety of ways. And sometimes speech takes a lot of time or less time. Anyway, that's a slight aside. I love your question about in-class learning. It strikes me that that's something that we could all be, I'm sure everybody in this room has suggestions about how to use the time and space differently. I was also thinking about your earlier point about labor and grading, and I'm worried about your labor as reflected by your comment. So I wonder if we could connect those two questions. And this is, again, perhaps more of a provocation than an answer. But I wonder if, since we do have so much freedom in what we teach and how we teach, could we be a bit more self-centered in how we, for instance, prep for those in-class learning opportunities, such that all that prep, it goes into, because it takes so much time, these kinds of suggestions. But if we choose to do that only on the themes and questions that we ourselves are working on, writing about, presenting on, so that all of our labor is not just double dipping, but triple dipping. Like, I really, really mean it. So for instance, I know our disciplines are different, so I don't know what would be a good example that would work for you. But so for me, for instance, I'm in philosophy, but I'm often bringing in pop culture. I'll prep out a TV show, for instance, because I'll assign it to the students because we're going to mine it for the concepts that we're learning. So it's a way to bring the philosophy to life, because now we have some characters and some scripts, but all that prep is so worth it because I'm going to be presenting on it. I'm going to be writing a paper on the philosophy of, Dear White People, which is the example I'm thinking of right now. And so it's the opposite of draining in a certain way. So I don't know if that lines up or resonates at all, if you can think of an example where a certain kind of additional prep for a lesson, which will expand the kinds of activities happening for the students, also then really makes the prep so much more meaningful for you research-wise. For anybody in the room, I'm super curious if that resonates.
Well, thanks so much to our panelists. Please join me in thanking our panelists for joining us today.